The security guard kicked the elderly black woman out of her own store without knowing she had built the business from nothing and employed every person who was now treating her like a criminal. 73-year-old Mrs. Ruby Johnson stood on the sidewalk outside Johnson's Family Market on that busy Saturday afternoon in October, watching through the large front windows as customers moved through the aisles of the grocery store she had operated for 38 years. To 26-year-old assistant manager Derek Williams, she had looked like just another elderly shoplifter who needed to be removed before she caused problems or stole merchandise. Mrs. Johnson had arrived at her store that afternoon wearing a faded pink floral dress that she had sewn herself in 1987, carrying a worn cloth shopping bag that had belonged to her mother, and moving with the careful steps of someone whose arthritis made every movement deliberate and sometimes painful. Her appearance was deliberately modest, reflecting both her practical nature and her desire to understand how her employees treated customers who didn't look like they had money to spend freely. The misunderstanding had begun when Mrs. Johnson entered the store through the main entrance and immediately noticed that several shelves in the produce section were nearly empty. The dairy cooler was making a grinding noise that suggested mechanical problems, and 2 of the checkout lanes were closed despite the Saturday afternoon rush that typically required all stations to be operational. Her concern for customer service and store maintenance had prompted her to begin inspecting the facility and taking mental notes about issues that needed immediate attention. Derek Williams had been working as assistant manager at Johnson's Family Market for 8 months, hired based on his associate degree in business management and his previous experience at a large chain grocery store in the suburbs. He had never met Mrs. Johnson personally, knowing her only as the store owner who rarely visited and left daily operations to the management team that had been running the business for several years. What Derek didn't understand was that Mrs. Johnson's rare visits were actually carefully planned assessments conducted while dressed as an ordinary customer to observe how her employees treated people who appeared to have limited resources or social status. She had been conducting these undercover evaluations quarterly for the past decade, believing that the true measure of a business was how it served customers who couldn't demand better treatment through wealth or influence. Mrs. Johnson's approach to business ownership had been shaped by her experiences growing up in rural Alabama during the 1950s, where her grandmother had operated a small general store that served both black and white customers during an era when such integrated commerce was unusual and sometimes dangerous. "Baby girl," her grandmother had told her while teaching her to measure flour and count change, "a store is only as good as how it treats the person with the least money and the most problems. Rich folks can shop anywhere, but poor folks need a place where they're treated like family." The grocery store that Mrs. Johnson had built from a single storefront in 1985 had become the economic anchor of a neighborhood that larger chains had abandoned as unprofitable. She had started with a $5,000 loan from her church congregation, working 18-hour days to stock shelves, manage inventory, and provide personal customer service that made shopping feel like visiting with a trusted friend rather than conducting a commercial transaction. The success of Johnson's Family Market had been built on Mrs. Johnson's understanding of community needs and her commitment to providing quality products at affordable prices for families who struggled to make ends meet. She had developed relationships with local farmers and suppliers that allowed her to offer fresh produce at prices that chain stores couldn't match, and she had established credit programs that helped customers bridge the gap between paydays without charging predatory interest rates. Derek's supervision that Saturday afternoon was complicated by the absence of the store manager, who had called in sick, and his responsibility for overseeing a staff of 6 part-time employees, most of whom were college students with limited retail experience. His approach to loss prevention had been influenced by his training at the suburban chain store, where suspected shoplifters were monitored closely and removed quickly to prevent theft and maintain an atmosphere of security for paying customers. When Derek noticed Mrs. Johnson moving slowly through the store, examining products carefully, and spending time in sections without making purchases, His interpretation was based on shoplifting prevention protocols, rather than recognition that she might be conducting legitimate business activities. Her behavior, looking behind products on shelves, checking expiration dates, and observing employee interactions with customers, seemed suspicious to someone who didn't understand that she was evaluating store operations and customer service quality. The incident that led to Mrs. Johnson's removal from the store began when she approached the customer service counter to inquire about the dairy cooler's mechanical problems and suggest that someone contact the repair service before the entire refrigeration system failed. Her question about maintenance issues should have been directed to management, but the part-time employee working the counter interpreted her concern as inappropriate customer interference in store operations. "Ma'am, customers aren't supposed to worry about store maintenance," said Jennifer Martinez, a 19-year-old college student who had been working at the store for 3 months. "If you have concerns about products, I can help you find what you need, but equipment issues are handled by management." Mrs. Johnson's response to Jennifer's dismissal was patient and educational, reflecting her understanding that young employees often needed guidance about customer service, and her recognition that this interaction was an opportunity to assess training effectiveness. "I understand that maintenance isn't typically a customer concern," Mrs. Johnson replied gently. "But when dairy products are at risk of spoiling due to refrigeration problems, it affects everyone who shops here. I was hoping someone could check on the cooler before products are damaged." Jennifer's decision to call Derek Williams to handle what she perceived as a difficult customer was based on her limited experience and her uncertainty about how to respond to Mrs. Johnson's persistent concern about store operations. Her description of the situation to Derek emphasized the elderly woman's focus on maintenance issues rather than the legitimate nature of her concerns. "Derek, there's an older lady here who keeps asking about the dairy cooler and seems to be inspecting the store like she works here or something," Jennifer reported over the store's communication system. "She's been walking around for 20 minutes without buying anything, and now she's telling us how to run the refrigeration system." Derek's response to Jennifer's call was shaped by his assumption that Mrs. Johnson was either a confused elderly customer who didn't understand appropriate boundaries, or a potential shoplifter who was using maintenance concerns as a cover for suspicious behavior. His approach to the situation reflected his training in loss prevention and his inexperience with community-based customer service. "I'll handle it," Derek replied, making his way from the back office to the customer service counter where Mrs. Johnson was still attempting to explain her concerns about the dairy cooler to Jennifer. His demeanor was professional but firm, conveying authority and impatience with what he perceived as an unnecessary disruption to store operations. "Ma'am, I understand you have concerns about our store operations, but these are matters that are handled by management and maintenance professionals," Derek said, his tone carrying the condescending quality that often characterized interactions with elderly customers who were presumed to be confused or troublesome. "If you're here to shop, I'd be happy to help you find what you need. If not, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." Mrs. Johnson's response to Derek's ultimatum was informed by decades of experience in retail management and her understanding that this moment represented a fundamental test of the customer service culture she had tried to establish in her store. Her decision about how to respond would determine whether this situation became a learning opportunity or a confrontation that revealed deeper problems with employee training and management oversight. "Young man, I appreciate your concern for store operations," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from 38 years of business ownership and community leadership. "Before I decide whether to leave, I'd like to speak with the store manager about the refrigeration issue and some other concerns I've observed during my visit today." Derek's reaction to Mrs. Johnson's request to speak with management revealed his territorial approach to authority, and his assumption that elderly customers who persisted in making requests were probably trying to cause problems or seek special treatment that they didn't deserve. His response would determine whether this situation could be resolved through appropriate customer service channels, or whether it would escalate into the kind of confrontation that could damage both customer relationships and employee morale. Thompson's response to Derek's request revealed the security guard's growing understanding that a serious mistake was unfolding in front of him. But his professional training required him to address the situation carefully to avoid embarrassing anyone while ensuring that proper respect was shown to someone he knew deserved it. "Derek, I think there might be some confusion here," Thompson said quietly, his voice carrying a note of caution that should have prompted the assistant manager to reconsider his approach. Derek's interpretation of Thompson's hesitation as reluctance to perform his security duties revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of both the situation and the relationships that governed the store's operations. His response demonstrated his assumption that authority came from position rather than understanding, and his impatience with what he perceived as unnecessary delay in removing a problematic customer. "Marcus, there's no confusion," Derek replied, his voice taking on an edge that suggested growing frustration with what he viewed as Thompson's failure to follow clear instructions. "This woman is disrupting our operations and refusing to leave when asked. Your job is to provide security, so please do it." Mrs. Johnson's decision to speak at this crucial moment was informed by her recognition that Derek's misunderstanding could escalate into a confrontation that would be painful for everyone involved and potentially damaging to the store's reputation in the community. Her intervention was designed to provide education rather than humiliation, reflecting her understanding that lasting change came through wisdom rather than punishment. "Mr. Thompson," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had guided 38 years of community leadership. "Perhaps you could help resolve this situation by explaining to Mr. Williams who I am and why his concerns about my presence in the store might be misplaced." Thompson's relief at Mrs. Johnson's invitation to clarify her identity was evident in his posture and expression, but his approach to the revelation was careful and respectful, designed to educate Derek without causing unnecessary embarrassment or undermining his authority in front of other employees and customers. "Derek," Thompson began, his tone remaining professional while conveying the gravity of the situation, "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Ruby Johnson. She's the owner of Johnson's Family Market, and she's been operating this store for 38 years. She's also the person who hired me and who signs both our paychecks every 2 weeks." The revelation hit Derek like a physical blow, transforming his understanding of the situation so completely that he struggled to process the implications of what Thompson had just told him. The elderly black woman he had been threatening to have removed from the premises was not a disruptive customer or potential shoplifter. She was his boss, the founder of the business, and the person whose vision and hard work had created every job in the store. Derek's immediate reaction was a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and growing panic as he realized that every assumption he had made, every condescending word he had spoken, and every threat he had issued had been directed at the woman who owned the business and who had the authority to terminate his employment immediately. "Mrs. Johnson, I had no idea. I've never seen. Nobody told me," Derek stammered, his professional composure completely shattered by the realization of his catastrophic error in judgment. His attempts to explain his behavior only made the situation worse, revealing the depth of his assumptions and the superficial nature of his understanding about the store's culture and values. Mrs. Johnson's response to Derek's panic was shaped by her decades of experience in mentoring young employees and her understanding that moments of failure could become opportunities for growth if handled with wisdom and compassion. Her approach reflected her grandmother's teaching about the difference between getting mad and getting smart. "Mr. Williams," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice remaining calm despite the obvious disrespect she had endured. "I understand that you didn't recognize me, and I appreciate that you were trying to do your job as you understood it. What concerns me more than the misunderstanding is the way you treated someone you believed was just an ordinary customer with legitimate concerns about store operations." The gathering crowd of employees and customers who had witnessed the confrontation began to understand the full scope of what had occurred, and their reactions ranged from embarrassment to amazement to concern about the implications for store operations and community relationships. Jennifer Martinez, the young employee who had first called Derek about Mrs. Johnson's presence, looked particularly stricken as she realized her role in initiating the chain of events that had led to this moment. Mrs. Johnson's recognition of Jennifer's distress prompted her to address the broader lessons that this incident could teach about customer service, community relationships, and the importance of treating every person with dignity regardless of their appearance or perceived status. Jennifer, Derek, and everyone who witnessed what happened here today, Mrs. Johnson said, her voice carrying across the store, I want you to understand that this situation didn't occur because I wasn't recognized as the owner. It happened because assumptions were made about an elderly customer's legitimacy and worth based on her appearance and behavior. The educational moment that Mrs. Johnson created drew on her understanding that real learning occurred when people could see the connections between individual actions and broader principles. Her explanation was designed to help her employees understand not just what had gone wrong, but why it mattered for every customer interaction they would have in the future. When I opened this store in 1985, I made a promise to this community that every person who walked through these doors would be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of how much money they spent or how they were dressed, Mrs. Johnson continued. That promise wasn't just about being nice. It was about understanding that a neighborhood store succeeds only when every neighbor feels welcome and valued. Derek's growing understanding of the magnitude of his failure extended beyond the immediate embarrassment of mistreating his employer to encompass recognition of how his behavior had violated the fundamental values that made Johnson's Family Market different from corporate chain stores. His response would determine whether this moment became a learning experience or simply a disciplinary incident. Mrs. Johnson, I am so sorry for how I treated you today, Derek said, his voice reflecting genuine remorse and growing understanding of the broader implications of his actions. I realize now that I completely misunderstood what customer service means in a community store like this one. Mrs. Johnson's acceptance of Derek's apology was conditional on his willingness to understand not just that he had made a mistake, but why that mistake revealed problems that needed to be addressed through changes in training, supervision, and store culture. Her response was designed to create accountability while preserving the possibility for growth and redemption. Derek, I appreciate your apology, and I believe you're sincere, Mrs. Johnson replied. But understanding what went wrong today is more important than apologizing for it. Can you tell me what you learned about customer service and community relationships from this experience? The question that Mrs. Johnson posed was designed to transform Derek's embarrassment into genuine learning, but it also served to educate everyone present about the values and principles that had guided the store's success for nearly 4 decades. His answer would determine whether this incident became a turning point in his understanding of retail management or simply a cautionary tale about the consequences of making assumptions. The 5 minutes that had passed since Derek first threatened to call security had transformed a routine Saturday afternoon into a profound teaching moment about respect, dignity, and the importance of treating every person as if they might be someone whose story you don't yet know. Mrs. Johnson's handling of the situation was about to move everyone present to tears, but not for the reasons anyone might have expected. Derek's response to Mrs. Johnson's question revealed a transformation that went far beyond professional embarrassment to encompass genuine understanding of the values and relationships that made community-based retail different from corporate chain store operations. Mrs. Johnson, he began, his voice carrying a humility that hadn't been present in any of his earlier interactions. I learned that I've been treating customers like potential problems instead of treating them like the neighbors and community members they actually are. The admission was exactly what Mrs. Johnson had hoped to hear, but her response was designed to deepen Derek's understanding while creating a learning experience for everyone present. Her decision to share the personal story behind her customer service philosophy would provide context that transformed this incident from a management failure into a profound lesson about dignity, respect, and the power of second chances. Derek, I want to tell you why treating customers with dignity matters so much to me, Mrs. Johnson said, her voice taking on the storytelling tone that had captivated Sunday school classes for decades. When I was 13 years old, I was working in my grandmother's general store in rural Alabama when a young white clerk treated her exactly the way you treated me today. Like she didn't belong, like her concerns didn't matter, like she was somehow less than human. The story that Mrs. Johnson shared drew gasps and tears from employees and customers who began to understand the historical context and personal pain that had shaped her approach to business and community service. Her willingness to be vulnerable about her family's experiences with discrimination created an emotional connection that made the lesson unforgettable for everyone present. My grandmother had built that store from nothing, serving both black and white customers during a time when that kind of integration was dangerous, Mrs. Johnson continued, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. But that young clerk saw an elderly black woman asking questions about spoiled milk, and he decided she was just a troublemaker who needed to be put in her place. Jennifer Martinez was the first employee to begin crying, her tears reflecting both her understanding of her role in recreating that historical pattern of disrespect and her recognition of the grace that Mrs. Johnson was showing by using this moment to teach rather than punish. Her emotional response prompted other employees to consider their own assumptions and behaviors in new ways. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm so sorry," Jennifer whispered, her voice breaking as she processed the connections between past and present discrimination. "I should have listened to your concerns about the dairy cooler instead of assuming you were just being difficult." Mrs. Johnson's response to Jennifer's tears was maternal and encouraging, reflecting her understanding that genuine learning often involved emotional processing, and that young people needed support as they developed empathy and wisdom. Her approach demonstrated the difference between accountability and condemnation. "Jennifer, baby, you couldn't have known my story, but you could have chosen to treat me with kindness," Mrs. Johnson said gently. "That's the lesson here, not that you should recognize who people are, but that you should treat everyone like they matter, because they do." The gathering of employees around Mrs. Johnson created an impromptu training session that was more powerful than any corporate workshop or management seminar, because it connected personal experience with professional responsibility in ways that made the lessons both memorable and meaningful. Her teaching drew on decades of experience in turning moments of conflict into opportunities for growth. "When I opened this store in 1985, I promised myself that no customer would ever be treated the way my grandmother was treated," Mrs. Johnson continued, her voice carrying the weight of family history and community commitment. That promise wasn't just about the past. It was about creating a future where every person who needed groceries could shop with dignity. Marcus Thompson's visible emotion as he listened to Mrs. Johnson's story reflected his understanding of the courage it had taken for her to build a successful business while maintaining her commitment to serving customers who were often overlooked or mistreated by other establishments. His own experiences as a young black veteran had taught him about the importance of institutions that offered respect and opportunity. Derek's realization that his behavior had not only violated store policies, but had also betrayed the historical mission and personal sacrifices that had created his job, prompted him to ask questions that demonstrated genuine desire to understand and improve rather than simply avoid future mistakes. "Mrs. Johnson, how can I learn to see customers the way you do?" Derek asked, his question revealing understanding that this was about more than following different procedures. It was about developing different values and perspectives. "I don't want to ever make anyone feel the way I made you feel today." Mrs. Johnson's response to Derek's question provided the framework for transformation that would benefit not only him, but every employee who witnessed this moment of teaching and redemption. Her approach emphasized practical wisdom alongside moral principles, creating actionable guidance that could be implemented immediately. "Derek, start by remembering that every person who walks through that door has a story you don't know," Mrs. Johnson replied. "They might be a grandmother trying to stretch her Social Security check to feed her family, or a single mother working 3 jobs to keep her children housed and fed, or a successful business owner who chooses to dress modestly because that's how they were raised. The practical wisdom that Mrs. Johnson shared drew tears from customers who recognized their own struggles in her descriptions, and from employees who began to understand their role in either supporting or undermining their neighbor's dignity during vulnerable moments of need. This store exists because this community needed a place where people could shop without being judged, questioned, or made to feel unwelcome. Mrs. Johnson continued, her voice growing stronger as she articulated the vision that had sustained her through 38 years of challenges and changes. Every person who works here has the power to either honor that mission or betray it with every interaction. The transformation that occurred in Johnson's family market that afternoon created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence customer relationships, employee training, and community connections for years to come. Mrs. Johnson's decision to teach rather than punish had created a more powerful learning experience than any disciplinary action could have achieved. 6 months after the incident that nearly resulted in Mrs. Johnson being ejected from her own store, Derek Williams was promoted to store manager with Mrs. Johnson's personal recommendation. His transformation from someone who treated customers with suspicion to someone who embodied the store's values of dignity and respect had been so complete that he became a mentor for new employees and a community advocate for customer service excellence. The story of what happened that Saturday afternoon became part of the store's training program for new employees, demonstrating both the importance of treating every customer with respect and the transformative power of leaders who choose education over retribution when mistakes occur. The lesson was clear. Assumptions about people based on appearance or behavior could lead to catastrophic errors in judgment, but those errors could become opportunities for growth when handled with wisdom and grace. Jennifer Martinez completed her degree and returned to work full-time at Johnson's Family Market, where she developed customer service innovations that made the store even more welcoming and accessible for elderly customers and families with limited resources. Her experience of witnessing Mrs. Johnson's grace under pressure had inspired her to pursue a career in community development and social justice. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Click the next one, subscribe, and share this with someone who still believes in kindness. Mrs. Johnson's legacy at Johnson's Family Market extended far beyond the business success she had achieved to encompass the values she had instilled, the community she had served, and the lessons she had taught about dignity, respect, and the power of choosing understanding over anger when faced with injustice. Her response to being kicked out of her own store had created a more powerful teaching moment than any planned training session could have achieved. The elderly black woman who had been threatened with removal for asking about dairy cooler maintenance had used that moment of disrespect to remind everyone present that customer service was about more than selling products. It was about honoring the humanity and dignity of every person who trusted you with their business. Her tears that afternoon were not tears of pain or anger, but tears of hope that the next generation of employees would understand that serving a community meant treating every neighbor like family, regardless of how they looked, how they dressed, or how much money they appeared to have. The 5 minutes that transformed Derek Williams from a corporate-minded assistant manager into a community-focused leader demonstrated that the most powerful changes often occurred not through punishment or termination, but through patient teaching and the kind of grace that turns moments of failure into opportunities for redemption and growth.